This is Up Close, SABC News weekday program that profiles men and women making waves in their industries, African icons, rising stars, idols and veterans. If they're in the news, then you can catch their story right here. I'm Sabam Segura. Stay tuned for the next half hour as we talk to one of Africa's most charismatic social and political commentators, Professor Adam Habib. Professor of Political Science and the current Vice-Chancellor of Wits University, Adam Habib studied at the University of Kwazulu-Natal and Wits before moving on to do his MPhil and PhD in New York. Although best known to television audiences for his analysis and research work in politics, he has a decade that he has spent in South Africa's tertiary institutions, starting off at the universities of Durban-Westville as well as Kwazulu-Natal. He has also found time to contribute as editor to journals such as Transformation and Politkon, as well as sit on a number of boards and councils, published numerous books and articles. Very, very busy man. Today we get up close with Professor Adam Habib. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you very
How does it feel when somebody just, tries to summarize your career in like 30 seconds?
Well,
like
it's interesting that most people tend to summarize the political analyst and the academic part. They don't do the other parts.
The other parts, and that's why we're here. So we want to know about the other parts. I want to start by asking you, who would you say is Adam Habib? I read somewhere that, you spent time in India, and for the first time you felt what? Un-Indian.
Yeah, I mean, I went for the first time I went to India was in 2008 and 9. So I must have been, 42, 43.
Yes.
I'd never ever imagined going to India, but I had to go for work. And
Yes.
and actually confirmed that I'm very un-Indian in a lot of ways. That actually we have this image of what it means to be Indian. And most South Africans of Indian ancestry think they're Indian, but actually, if they go to India, they'll feel out of place. This is a very different place from what they imagine.
Yeah.
They have a particular imagination of being Indian, but that doesn't accord. It's a very different society. It's a complex society. It's a very interesting society.
Okay.
But it's not. It's not. I didn't see
you,
myself.
yeah.
It's not me. It's not who I am. In a lot of ways, it affirmed my Africanness. It affirmed the fact that I'm South African and African. This is where I come from. This is what I know. This is what has informed my identity.
What was just one of the things that made you feel different when you were there?
Well, it's just, multiple things. It's food. I mean, you think, well, you're South African Indian, you eat curry, you're in India, you eat the curry is very, very different, actually. They're fundamentally different types of food.
Okay.
Your interactions, your engagements, your value systems, the way you engage with people, the vernacular you use. There are things that I would use as I would say words. Bru. Or,
of course.
Chief.
And
they would look at me and say, what's a chief? That it's the simple thing. Suddenly I realized.
Yes.
Actually, I come from South Africa. I come from the continent. I am as African as you can imagine. And actually, this is a very foreign place. It is no less foreign than Paris or London or New York. I could be in all of these places, and I'd be a foreigner. And the same applies to in that case, Delhi.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you should raise. I mean, you comment a lot about racial diversity and our racial identity. So for you to also, come full circle and say, I know who I am and I'm an African. Let's go back to where your life started, back in Pietermaritzburg. Everybody's going to think that I'm bringing everybody from Pietermaritzburg here because I went to school there, but I'm very happy to find out that you're from Pietermaritzburg.
Well, I loved Maritzburg. I loved it for the first 22 years of my life.
Yes.
Maritzburg was where I was. It's where I went for short holidays out of Pietermaritzburg, but that was a lovely small town. You knew everybody.
Yes.
You kind of interacted. It was a very racialized town when I was there. It's changed very much now. But when I was there, we were kind of middle class family living in the bottom part of the city.
Okay.
Because that's where Indian people were allowed to live. And African people lived in Sabantu and in Bali, and you know, it was a very distinct city. And I got to know the city well, because as I progressed and as I grew up, I also began to be conscientized. And as I began to be conscientized, I saw parts of the city I'd never imagined as a kid. So, you know, as a child, I would stay in town, but I would take a bus to go to a school, which was in Northdale, which was an Indian kind of township. And I would go there for school, and I would come back every this thing. But then as I reached, 17, 18, went to university in Pietermaritzburg, I, began to become politically active. I used to work for Second Trust, and Second Trust used to do lots of work in Sobantu and in Bali and Popameni, and we used to work with workers in Kasatu and do literacy work and do some political work. And so I got, I used to travel all of these places. This kind of became a place where I knew.
Professor, how did you become politically conscious? I mean, you, as you say, your father was a businessman, you lived in a closed community, you went to a Muslim school. When did you start asking those questions and becoming conscious?
It's two things. One, I mean, my big event was in 1980. And in 1980, what happened was I had just gone to high school.
Okay.
And when you went to high school, and suddenly there was an explosion of boycotts, both in the Western Cape and in Kwazulu-Natal.
Okay.
Largely around equal rights, equal education, etc. It happened 4 years after Soweto.
Okay.
And it blew up in mainly colored and Indian schools.
Okay.
And that was my first conscientization. I come into high school, everybody's sitting in the ground, so I went to the ground, which seemed exciting. And suddenly, an entire, we had these kind of very peculiar kind of American songs, Kumbaya, my lord, Kumbaya, and, we'd kind of march all around. And then, there was Peter Tosh, we don't need no education, all of these kinds of things. And then suddenly it began a conscientization process. And I began to read on Biko and Mandela and Sobukwe. Initially, I didn't understand the differences between their thoughts, what they stood for, the ANC, Azapo. But gradually, I began to this thing. And it opened up a new life for me. So often, I used to have a real problem in school, because I would, then after that, every year, you'd have, in your English classes, you'd have to give a speech.
Yes.
And I'd stand up, and I'd say, my speech is on, they'll ask me what you're speaking on, and I'd say Nelson Mandela, and they'd say, sit down, we don't want to hear that. And then the next week, they'll ask me to say another speech, and I'll say Steve Biko. And, because the teachers were very conservative. It was very dangerous to do those kinds of things.
But how did your parents feel about that, about your interests? Were they aware that you're starting to become very politically
My mum had died when I was very young, when I was 10 years old. So I was really brought up by an extended family, by aunts. My father had been politically involved in something called the Unity Movement.
Okay.
And he wasn't really active, but he's in the 60s. What had happened is the Unity Movement, or at least some in the Unity Movement, tried to launch an arms struggle. And so what they did is he was a businessman, so they used his business to funnel money. And so they got caught, they were put in Robben Island, he wasn't. But the fact that his passport was taken away, so from very young, in the household, there was some experience of what it means.
So that's where it really started.
That's
there were conversations happening at home, etc. And I believe your father also moved to Botswana. So you were aware of what is going on in the country, and then you got interested when you were in high school.
That's right. I got particularly interested, and then since then I went into university. I did political science. I thought it would teach me about politics. It taught me all other kind of things, but it didn't teach me about South African politics in the way I imagined. And then I wanted to do law at one stage, but at that time you had to do Latin and particularly Afrikaans, and I didn't want to do Afrikaans. And so I didn't go into law, and I went into political science and honors and masters, and got involved in becoming an academic. And it's a kind of ironical path, because that wasn't an intended path. It happened by chance and circumstance rather than
But it's always like that. It always happens by default.
That's right.
You were trying to pursue something else, and then something else happened. I'm interested in knowing your character when you were a lot younger. I read somewhere that you're quite a rebel rouser. But in fact, before you even go into that, let me take a quick break, and then I'll come back and we'll have this conversation. After the break, we continue to get up close with Professor Adam Habib. Do you have any suggestions or comments for our show? We'll greatly appreciate them. Our email address is upclose@sabc.co.za and our Twitter handle @upclosesabc. See you just now. Thank you for staying with us as we continue our conversation with Professor Adam Habib. I'm interested in knowing your character as a young man. I read, like I said, that you were quite rebellious.
I was completely rebellious. I broke every rule in the book. So, I would go late to school, and I would take, and at that time you would get six KD.
Yes.
And I used to go every morning.
So
late.
that was not a deterrent. No. You still do it again.
I'd walk in and I'd walk straight to the principal office, bend down, take the 6, and go to my office. I broke every rule in the book. I used to smoke in school, which was terrible. I became politically active, and in part it was the rebelliousness
as well. Yes,
yeah. Rebelliousness about it. I was a very rebellious thing. In a lot of ways, we had a 30-year reunion in my school.
Yes.
About 2 weeks ago in Pietermaritzburg.
Okay.
I went down and I met some of the teachers.
And what did they say?
They said this was a real problematic child.
And today he's Vice-Chancellor of one of the best universities. It's like, how did this happen?
No, so it is I was an incredibly rebellious child. And I often don't want my children to hear what I got up to.
Really?
I got up into the worst antics that you can imagine.
But how did that impact your schoolwork then, if you were that naughty?
It did actually. I did pass every year. And I did pass. I didn't pass as well as I should have. In primary school, I did very well up until standard 6, standard 7. When I went into high school, I began to do far less better. Mm-hmm. I got exemptions. I did all of that. But I never performed at the level that I should have.
Yes.
And that's in part had to do with the fact that I never paid the kinds of attention that I should have to schoolwork. And it's something that at one level I try to convince my sons, for instance, are much more diligent than I am. In part because they get that from their mother.
Okay.
Who's much more diligent. Fatima was always much more diligent as a scholar.
Yes.
But I was utterly rebellious. I recall an event. One of the things you were allowed in the school was you go to mosque on Fridays.
Okay.
For this thing, and so we would go to mosque, and the principal was a Muslim. And he would go to mosque, and I once took his shoes and threw it into the drain, the water drain.
Why?
I have no idea, actually. And then told the school that we did, and so everybody waited for him to come bare feet out of back. But I would do things like utterly idiotic things like that.
So you're a jokester.
I was an entire this thing, and so it is something that I'm now a bit embarrassed about, and I don't want my kids to know about sufficiently. So I should be careful how much I say on.
No, make sure they don't watch this program.
Right.
That's very interesting. That you are now, in charge of young people at their most rebellious stage. Students are the worst. So you're well suited, or is it karma? Has it come back to?
Well, it might be a combination of both, but it's also something that I understand. I think young people must go through that period because it develops them. And I think that to demand that they do not begin to have the kinds of social experimentations that are necessary to innovate and change our world for the better. Young people fighting for justice is an important thing. It makes the world a better place. And yes, sometimes they're not as pragmatic as they need to be, but that's in the nature of learning. And I wasn't as pragmatic, and it's something that I utterly understand. So when students march in my offices, I understand that. I understand the toy. I understand that they have a right to do so. Yes. And they have a right as citizens of this country to be able to do that.
Let's go back to your university years, because that's when you met your wife. How did you guys meet? Did you get married immediately?
No. We actually met. I mean, there's two things that are quite interesting about my meeting my wife. The first is she was a much more diligent student, and so we passed each other in school years, but we never really got to know each other.
So you knew her even in
She was
high
in another
school,
school, but she would come for debating
Yes.
at our school, and she was always in the debating team. And I was, the kind of rebellious youth looking down at people who were so diligent. And then what happened is we met at university.
Yes.
And I got politically involved quite early as I went into university, and so I would be spending large amounts of time away. And so I often wasn't in the class sometimes. And she was always in the class, and she'd take wonderful notes, and so I'd go borrow the notes and copy them. And we got to know each other, and she'd explain to me, and we developed a camaraderie and fell in love effectively. And that's at university. And that happened for a long period. My family wasn't very thrilled with her.
Why was it?
And her family wasn't very thrilled with me. We came from different linguistic castes, actually. It's kind of peculiar thing that goes back. And none of us actually ever spoke any of the Indian languages. So it was all very
Isn't
bizarre.
that amazing? Yeah, that the caste system still continues here in South Africa.
This kind of
and
thing.
Most people, they don't even speak the
languages. We don't speak the language, we didn't. But it was the older generations. And so Fatima and I concocted a plan after we finished our first year is to go to Wits.
Okay.
And I didn't tell my parents, my aunts. My father, who was at that time in Botswana, knew about this, but his sisters were not into it, and so he was trying to go under the radar, not get involved. So she told her parents that she's going to Wits, and they said, okay, well that's a wonderful idea, get her away from him. And so she went to Wits, and then the day I had also applied quietly, got a place, and then after she had been there and already been accepted, and in the first year I suddenly told my family, sorry,
I'm going to Wits.
And they were completely stunned, and I got in the car and I left for Wits.
Oh, that's a lovely story.
That's right. So Wits for me is
a
kind of refuge. It's a place where we became refugees of love,
wonderful.
And that's how we came to Wits.
Yes. Let's take a quick break, Professor. We're going to come back and continue chatting to Professor Adam Habib. Do you have any suggestions or comments for us? Please share them with us. Our email address is upclose@sabc.co.za. Our Twitter handle @upclosesabc. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us as we wrap up our conversation with Professor Adam Habib. Prof, you sound like you've had a fun life. I just want to touch on the time that you spent in New York. What can you tell us about your studies
that was also odd because I came to Wits, studied, and then ironically when we left Wits, I couldn't get a research assistantship in Wits. They said to me, well, there's other places like UDW. So it was shocking for me when somebody in Wits told me that.
Wow.
And so I did get a job ironically at UDW. And UDW was an enormous experience because it was a very politicized campus. I got politically involved again very extensively. And one of the big things in UDW was in the 1990, there was the first Iraq war. And there was big demonstrations at the university and the US Consular General had come. And basically, I had criticized him from the floor about the war, etc. And he amusingly sent, a couple of months later, sent an application form for the Fulbright and said, would you like to, you've been very critical of the United States, would you like to at least see what it is, and then you can make a judgment on it. And I applied, and I did get a partial scholarship, but it was only a partial one, and then EOC offered me a full scholarship to go and do a PhD. And I, decided I wanted to go, and I didn't know anything about the American universities. And I decided I wanted to go to a university in New York called the New School because it was established by refugees from the Holocaust in Germany in the 1930s. And I thought it's a politically progressive institution. Now, I had forgotten that 80 years later it had changed quite dramatically. But I didn't land up there, but the agency that was managing it had put me at the City University of New York, at the graduate school, which specializes in PhDs. And it put me right in the middle of New York City. And it was an enormous learning experience because what it showed me is how to be both national and global. It taught me to be African and human, that there are struggles all over the world. And my years in South Africa made me a profound nationalist, if you like. I was proud of my country. I wanted to transform my country. And what New York did is it focused me on my country, but it also said that there's a world, and we want to transform our world. And it made me both a cosmopolitan being, but not in a way that I denied my Africanness.
Yes.
I now, and you'll see I write, I say you can be both African and human.
Yeah.
And that's what I am. I see myself as South African, as African, but if there's a struggle happening in Palestine or in Tibet or in New York or in the Appalachian Mountains in the United States or in Brazil, all of those struggles are my struggles as well, because I'm also human.
And it's fascinating that most people who spend time in big cities such as New York come back with that experience, you know, that I am me, but I'm bigger than the identity that I had when I was just here in South Africa. And Johannesburg is becoming one of those cities as well. Professor, 2 questions for you before we wrap up. The first one is, has your, what do I say, free speech ever gotten you into big trouble?
It's always gotten me into big trouble. I mean, you know that I was deported from the United States.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, in 2006, I was, after long having studied there, going to the United States a lot, in 2006, I think it was, I was deported from the United States when I flew in. And
because of what did you say?
We don't know. They never ever said.
Oh, okay.
We think it was the second Iraq war that, and I was involved in the demonstrations there. And then what had happened is, for 3 years I was barred. They actually said, you're a terrorist. And what happened is the American civil liberties, my children's passports were taken, Fatima's passports were taken. And then the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Sociological Association, and the American Association of University Professors went to court on my behalf. And for 2.5 years, they fought the case. And when Barack Obama came into this thing, they signed, they agreed to allow me in. They didn't tell me why they barred me. They said, however, the reasons that were utilized will no longer be utilized. But what it means is when I fly into the United States, I have to inform them that I'm coming.
Do you ever get afraid? Do you ever get afraid?
Well, I always laugh and say that if I was in the United States and if I get caught speeding in some small dorpy in the middle of the Midwest, they'll lock me up because I'm on their systems. And I am concerned when my children travel in the United States that they must not be targeted in any particular way. But it is something. Yeah, I must say that has never happened outside the United States, but this has been an issue in the United States, and I suspect that partly it's got to do with my ideas and the fact that I'm fairly open about it.
Well, I'll tell you from the news side, we really appreciate the fact that you're willing to share your opinions with us, and we're looking forward to more and wishing you the best at Wits.
Thank you very, very much.
I wanted to ask you about the TV games that you play, but we've run out of time because I heard you play TV games. Well, we have to wrap up the show. That's today's edition of Up Close. Catch us same time weekdays on SABC News, the SAB channel. 404, catch some of our favorite episodes like this one. We're going to put it up on youtube.com/SABC News. My Twitter handle @Tepi Mutsekua. Drop us an email, upclose@sabc.co.za. Bye-bye.